Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brooke Berry. I'm the Dean of Students, Equity and Inclusion here at Marymount, and we're really excited tonight to continue our series of programs during Black History Month tonight to discuss the intersectionality of identities in the community, with one being those who are both Latinx and Black, and what that means. So tonight, we want to start with our student intern, Ms. Odalis Linares, who is a senior criminal justice major, and she's going to be welcoming and introducing our speaker tonight. Thank you, Odalis.
Good evening, everyone. Ella is a diversity and inclusion advocate, learning development specialist, and trainer slash facilitator with a commitment to promoting diversity, creating social change, and serving as a resource for transformative communities. Ella formerly led the 4A's practice focusing on programs that elevate workplace, culture, raise consciousness, and build career pathways. Before that, Ella led the 4A's educational partnerships, creating innovative strategies for programs designed to strengthen high school career training, focusing on students of color. Ella has over 10 years of experience as a trained facilitator, collaborating with organizations and teams seeking development in areas ranging from process management to leadership development and diversity learning. Her prior experience in the political field has also informed her insight into community development and programming. Ella holds an MBA in marketing from St. Peter's University and a BA in political science and Latino studies from Rutgers University.
So I guess I can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. So yes, as was mentioned in my bio, my name is Ela Mesa. I am the founder of Ela Mesa Consulting, where we do diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all types of different organizations, education, corporate, nonprofit, you name it. And I'm sure as many of you already know, based on what's happening just in society and our climate, this has been a real turning point in just everywhere, right? In all pockets of society where we're having conversations related to intersectionality, to diversity, to unconscious bias, discrimination in ways that we've just never been having them before. So I think this is a really great time to be having this conversation. Thank you to the administration, to Student Affairs for putting this together, Brooke especially, and we're gonna have a really good discussion today. Now, what I will start this with, so I've been doing this for well over a decade, facilitating all types of development, professional development, learning and development, and of course, most passionately and most specifically, diversity and inclusion. So I'm looking at the screen right now and I see that just about everyone has their profile picture up or their name. So I'm gonna ask if you can, right? If you have the ability to please, turn your camera on, because what's going to happen today is I'm not here to lecture in it by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. What we're going to be doing today is participating in a conversation. The value that we're going to get out of today's conversation is going to come from you, right? I'm not the expert in the room. You know yourself, your campus, your experiences better than I do. And so we're really going to get a lot more value and just engagement if we feel like we're in the same room and we're feeling each other. So if you can, I'm going to go ahead and ask, go ahead. Thank you, Anna Sophia. I see you popped your camera on. And so if anyone else is there that's listening, just pop your camera on. It'll help us all get a sense that we're in the same room and that we have, we can do some more sharing. Aside from that, and I'll just reiterate, I will be looking to you all to share. So with that in mind, we're talking about this diversity conversation. Some things can be uncomfortable. We are all coming from different walks of life. But at the end of the day, what we want to do, what we want to get out of this is moving the needle forward to, the type of psychological safety, the type of understanding and openness that comes from inclusion efforts, right? So if we're really being inclusive, if we're really moving towards creating opportunity and access for everyone, then what we want to get out of today is authentic, safe, real sharing. And so here are some just quick ground rules that'll help us get there. First and foremost, speak your truth, right? So I'll be opening up the floor, like I said to you all. We want to hear your truth, even if you disagree, even if it sounds crazy. This is a space where we're going to respect everything that everyone is saying. And even if we disagree, we can do so respectfully. And so we want people to come in with their lived experience and share from that point of view. Lean into the discomfort. If there are things that you hear that you can't relate to, don't like, feels weird, that's really what we're here to do, is talk about some of these pockets that blind spots that we've been ignoring for a long time, right? Why are we at this place in society now where organizations, companies, universities are scrambling now to figure out what's our diversity strategy? It's because we haven't been talking about the things that have been at the forefront, right? The disparity, the discrimination, the marginalization of people. So, and the reason being because those are uncomfortable things to acknowledge and really have conversations about. So what we want is to lean into that discomfort here. Commit to non-closure. So this isn't going to be a linear conversation where at the end of it you will have walked away with an A, right, or a concrete understanding of something, but rather this is a journey. We're all on it, and this is just one step in that journey. Today's session will just be one step in that journey. So really think of it as like just another tool or another opportunity to create some more access. Embrace paradox, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today, is intersectionality. What are some of the things that can seem or that we live paradoxically, and how two truths can exist at the same time, right? Or more than two truths can exist at the same time. We're going to be learning a little bit. This isn't about perfection. There is no right answers to any of the questions I'll be asking you. And really, we just want to, have fun, respect each other, and really make it a conversation. So I will turn it over to the group now that I'm looking. Thank you everyone who popped their camera on. Ashley, I see you there as well. And then everyone else is shy. So what I'm still going to ask everyone to do, since we are a small group, really quick, let's just go around. I just want to see who's on the call. If you can just, I can see most of your names, but if you can just tell me who you are. Are you a student? What year are you? Just so we get a sense of who all is in the room before we get started. Ana Sofia, why don't you start?
Sure. I was actually going to unmute myself right now. My name is Ana Sofia Alcaraz. I am a staff at Marymount, so I work at the Center for Global Engagement. And I didn't realize if I missed a certain aspect.
Just who you are. That's perfect. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything you want to share, as long as it's not too long. Yeah. Ashley, you're next in my lineup, so why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm a sophomore here at Marymount.
Thanks for being here, Ashley. Cool. Carrington, you're hiding, but I see you. Tell us who you are. Carrington. You're not there. All right, we're going to skip you, Carrington. Victor.
Carrington's a senior. I don't know if it's working.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Hi, my name is Victor Betancourt. I'm with the administration, and I apologize. I'm just in the middle of dinner right now.
No worries. I appreciate you being here, only if you can. Thank you for participating anyway. Sarah.
I think Sarah put her details in the chat.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you everyone. And again, thank you for being here. We are a smaller group, but I think that that's going to really be just beneficial for the discussion. So we'll be looking to you all, like I said, to, add value, bring your lived experiences, and of course, at any point in time, if you have questions, you can certainly stop me as we go through this. So let's see. All right, so the very first thing we're going to do, let's see, I think we can still send people off into breakout groups, even though we're a small group. And we'll do it just for a little less time, since there will be kind of less conversation with the amount of people. But what I want to just start right away with, we're going to dive right in before we start getting into any lecture discussion. I want to hear from you. When we're talking about cultural identity or culture, what are race, ethnicity, and nationality? What are those things, right? So I'm gonna send everyone off into, actually, I'm just gonna do 2 groups. And I wanna have everyone in the group participate and define, right? Come up with either a consensus or just a recap of what you guys end up discussing. What is race? What is ethnicity? And what is nationality, right? Define that as thoroughly as you can. How does it show up? What does it look like? Let me go ahead and get you all into the breakout group, ethnicity and nationality. So in just a moment, you should be getting an invite. And then we'll come back in about 5 to 7 minutes. So we'll see you all then. Designate someone to share back what you all came up with, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and just start with Ashley and Odalis. What did you come up with? Pretty straightforward questions, but love to hear kind of how you framed each of those 3.
So we both technically viewed it the same. Like we would always been confused when being asked like the differences, but we came to saying like race is mostly like agreed to physical differences that they see like significant based on, and then ethnicity would be based on like sharing culture, language, and beliefs. So that's where like we said like as us would be saying like Hispanic. And then for nationality, I said that kind of is a little bit more narrow. So like for Ashley, she'd be saying like Honduran, and then I would be saying Salvadorian because it's to a particular nation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, pretty straightforward. Yeah, any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, so like we also mentioned how like on applications and stuff, they ask us about ethnicity, and I've always been confused about that because sometimes I will like choose other and like say, oh, Hispanic or Honduran, or because I was always get confused. And then like I've learned that technically we classify under white, but I'm like still confused on that.
Right.
Yeah. But we just talked about that too.
It's pretty confusing. And I mean, that's really the basis of this conversation is where are those parameters coming from? What do these terms actually mean, depending on the context in which they're used, right? And how do we identify, how do we associate with them, you know, depending on whether somebody's asking us casually or whether it's on a form or something along those lines. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, race being primarily sort of a physical characteristic, ethnicity, the culture and language and beliefs. So, and you mentioned being Hispanic as a ethnicity you would identify with, and then nationality being the particular nation. And you both mentioned your respective countries of origin. Is being American part of your nationality? That's a real question.
Yeah, technically, I mean, there's times where I did identify, but again, it was kind of like confusion. Like I would put, I think, well, before I kind of switched them. So like I would put like, I think race, like Hispanic, and then for like ethnicity, I think I would end up putting white because like also Hispanic wouldn't be one of the choices, or I would write other and then Hispanic again sometimes.
Yeah, and when you think about something like the census that is meant to capture, right? It's meant to capture so that we're all quote unquote represented. And let's say you're putting down white because you don't have another box that you identify with, or maybe you do identify with white, whatever the case may be. It's not an accurate capture or depiction of what, you know, what communities really look like or what's really happening, right? When we talk about using that as a tool for representation, right? So there, it's faulty right from the beginning. We can see that. Okay, let's go to the other group. Who was in that group? We have Ana Sofia, Sarah, and Victor. Anyone can share from the group.
Sure. Well, Sarah and I were talking, and so we had very similar thoughts. So race for us is typically physical characteristics from each of our home countries in general, because both of us are from different countries. It is a lot of times tied to color of skin. But even that is very shifting. So the way what is considered Black or white or mixed race in one country is considered differently in another. So even though it's physical, it's changing from
Absolutely.
location to location. Ethnicity is, as Odalis and Ashley said, very similar to cultural identity, but I think there's also an element of background to it, like where it's like almost like where your parents are from, like almost tied to DNA too, but it's culture too. It's one of those that's shifting. And then nationality was one of the citizenship or where you grew up, the like location, the nation where you grew up.
Right. Okay. Nation, where you grew up. So so what I will, these things are complicated, right? These are straightforward words and we use them all the time. But when we really take a look, it isn't so clear, right? Where the line is drawn isn't so clear. But I agree, you know, with all the things that you said. There's all these nuances. And then when you talk about nationality in particular, you said where you grew up, right? Like the nation that you're from. And even that in and of itself can be tricky, right? Because there's some of us that have sort of transnational identities, right? Maybe we spent a few years in the Dominican Republic and maybe we spent a couple of years here, or maybe we moved back to the Dominican Republic. Maybe we have dual citizenship like I do. So, you know, what do you identify as, right? I could say I'm Dominican American and that's my nationality, or I could say I'm Dominican, or it just depends on the context, right? Of who I'm talking to and what's the point that I'm trying to make. But either way, you know, based on everything that we're hearing from you all, it's complex, right? It's not something that is actually as clear as these terms that are, you know, consistently used to categorize people, right? And then who are the people defining and coming up with these categories, right? Again, kind of going back to this idea of the census or, you know, different tools that are used for representation, but who's coming up with these terms that are being used, right? And how do they really capture? So just as you all said, this is just like the quick, actual, straightforward definitions that you would find online, right? Race is the concept of dividing people into populations on the basis of physical characteristics, skin color, facial types, etc., which usually result from shared genetic ancestry. So the genetic ancestry part came up kind of in ethnicity, kind of in nationality, right? It bleeds through. Ethnicity, population whose members identify with each other through shared cultural traits. We all said that, right? It's usually defined by ancestry as well, whether presumed or actual, right? So there was, and I'll just speak, you know, from my lens, from my perspective, I happen to be Dominican, so I have a little bit more knowledge about, you know, some of the race and culture issues there. There was a period of time, I think actually it's still happening, where you have Haitians who live in the Dominican Republic that are getting deported back to Haiti, right? Same thing that's happening here in the United States, but that have lived their whole lives, have no family in Haiti, have never been to Haiti, were born in the Dominican Republic, but now because of some new legislation and you know, discriminatory practices, now they're being deported back to Haiti where they have no sense of nationality. I mean, they are Haitian, right? But that's not the country that they belong to in terms of how they identify. They identify as Dominican, right? They know they're Haitian, but they feel Dominican. And so, you know, this question of legal citizenship, how does that really, again, determine, you know, how we fall into each of these categories? So these are just kind of the broader understanding. Cultural identity, it is a mix between these ideas of race, ethnicity, and nationality, but these lines are blurred. We can see that. You know, they don't always fit into a perfect box. And so when we start to think about what culture is really, when we wrap our minds around all these things, because it can include so many other things. It can include, I was looking up other definitions such as, you know, heritage, or I don't know, there were so many different other terminologies for how we would understand culture. But at the end of the day, culture is really communication. How do we communicate? What do we communicate about? What are we saying? Who am I saying that I am? How am I interpreting you and communicating with you based on what I believe you are, right? It is our shared knowledge about one another, even if that knowledge, you know, may or may not be clear, may or may not be correct, but there's some basis for that shared knowledge, those beliefs, those values, those meanings. And then within that, right, there's definitely subgroups. There's subgroups of culture that may share certain beliefs and values, but that may be communicating about different pieces or different, different generations, different groups in ways that don't necessarily fit into the collective. And at the very bottom, you see the last definition is a collective programming of the mind, right? That distinguishes members of one group. And so I always point to that because it really is a programming that happens when we start to think about, how do we define or how do we interpret people's experiences based on our limited or confusing definitions about what culture is or what identity is in these contexts. So the impact of culture, knowing that, it is a programming, it is the way in which we communicate, it is the norms for how we communicate. We know that cultural identity, right, or the culture within which we are immersed, has a significant impact on our community, on ourselves, on our organizations, on how we participate in our community. And here is where some of the challenges begin to show themselves. Because what we know is that if there is a dominant or primary culture and the society, the people that are part of the society are influenced and impacted by the dominant programming of that culture, then we start to see people who don't necessarily fit in that box, or people who look a little bit different than what we thought, or are not exactly, the definition of what we thought they were. They start to fall kind of into the outskirts, right? That's what marginalization really is. It is, sort of being moved out from what the mainstream and the norm is, because it doesn't fit into the cultural programming or the design for how the rules, right, and the communication that we've agreed on as a norm, as a society, right? And so that takes place on all levels. That takes place within the education system. That takes place in legislation, in policy. We see that across the board because, again, it is a pervasive programming that happens on all levels. So that brings us to this conversation about intersectionality. And the way that we have come to understand intersectionality is it's all of these different identities, right, that we possess as individuals and as groups. These are identities that we have. You see here all of the different ones that we can name very easily: education, race, sexuality, ability, age, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class. Many of these are, protected classes. When you think about, federal legislation intended to protect, let's say, employees at their workplace, many of these are actually specifically protected classes in which, if you were to be discriminated against due to your race or your sexuality or your age, and that's actually only recent, the sexuality one, that was instituted, but these are acknowledged, right, by our federal government as characteristics, as parts of our identity that merit, that require protection, right, under the law, so that we are not, right, marginalized or taken advantage of. But then how do you effectively do that, right, within systems where it's not really clear where those lines are when it comes to certain things, right? Especially when let's, as an example, looking at sexuality. Can anyone guess? Actually, let's look at gender, actually. I used to work in Midtown New York City doing diversity work, and I'm based out of Atlanta now, but in New York City alone, can anyone guess how many gender classifications exist officially?
5?
Close. Anybody else want to guess? Nobody's got it. Nobody's feeling lucky.
Sarah says 9 in the chat.
9. Last time I checked, this could be off, but last time I checked, which was maybe early COVID, there was 56 gender classifications in New York City, right? Now it's New York City, but also I would never, me even being in the diversity space, I would have never guessed that, right? I would have never thought that, but that is the world we're living in, what we're moving to now. And so there is, you cannot see someone with your plain eye and say, I know who that person is, what they are, how they identify, what box they fit in. And so again, these identities, right? There's one little arrow pointing to that person, but it's actually, as we saw just in defining those initial terms, these things are complex, right? They aren't sort of a one size fits all. When we're talking about sexuality, when we're talking about, education, what does that actually mean? What are the standards for education, gender, and so on, and ethnicity and race, how those things intersect. So when we look at intersectionality and the way that it is defined in our society, right? We're looking at, yeah. When we look at, the way that it is defined, we're looking at all of these different components, right? All of these different pieces that within themselves could stand alone, but at what point do they converge, right? So let me get us to the next. So intersectionality, the way that we understand it now, right? It is an interconnected nature of social categorization, such as what we just saw, race, class, gender. They can apply to an individual or a group, right? But the point is that the way we understand it now is that we know that these things overlap and they're interdependent in many ways. And because of the culture that we live in, there are systems of discrimination and disadvantage that can be compounded by having these different intersecting pieces. And so you'll hear many times people talking about intersectionality sort of just as like, I am a woman and I am queer, right? Or I am a woman and I'm Black. But really the term is meant to identify the specific convergence, a specific crossroads where there is a compounded disadvantage as a result of those two intersecting identities. So the term was actually coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a activist, author, professor, a pillar in her right in this space. But the reason why she specifically identified this term was because she started to notice that as it pertained to legislation, policy, and legal protections, there were a lot of protections that were being put in place, let's say, or social, services being put in place for, let's say, Black men, right, who are disadvantaged or marginalized within their communities. And then you're seeing programs geared towards women, but in the reality, the people who are benefiting most are white women. And so there suddenly becomes this pocket where Black women are literally in a blind spot, in a space where they're not advancing, receiving support, getting access anywhere near the same rate as their Black male counterparts or their white female counterparts, because of the way that these the way that the legislation and the protections and the services are being designed. This intersection of their identity has created now a further othering, right? A further disconnect from what is the norm, or what is even within that subcategory of being a marginalized group. Now there's even a further, layer when you start to look at how these various parts of our identity actually intersect. Is there anyone here that identifies with this notion, who has experienced sort of that compounding where you see, I don't want to say that, you have two identities that bring about a disadvantage, but where you have seen sort of that manifest, where you have these two parts of your identity sort of coming together in a given situation?
Well, I can talk on my experience. So I am a queer Latina. And so I have definitely felt that, where like queer spaces are typically very white focused, white male focused in particular. And so being Latina, like the struggles are a little bit different, especially with like coming out to family and things like that, and cultural, the way you are raised. But then in Latina spaces, it's a lot, sexuality is one of those things that in a lot of our communities, it's not necessarily talked about or really looked at as favorably, let's say. And so it definitely, you fall through the cracks in those senses.
Absolutely, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that personal aspect. And I know what you mean. I'm 36 years old, and my parents still think that my queerness is a phase. So I get it. I completely understand. And that is a really great example. It is a very unique and specific experience to you because of your culture, because of your Latinidad, your Latinness, your and being, a woman being queer. It's different, right, than it is to be, let's say, male and queer in the Latino community. Not necessarily better or worse, but a very specific lived experience that you're having as a result of those unique intersecting identities. So here we take it a step further to look at where these things converge, most specifically as it relates to the Latino community and the Black community, right? What does that mean? What does it look like? How does it intersect? Where are the areas in which we're aware of the nuances, and where have we, where are those blind spots, right, that we have not yet uncovered and taken a look at, or where people's voices aren't necessarily heard, or where they're not being seen for who they are, right, for what they are. So this is just a quick picture of, some of our Hollywood celebs who are Black, right? They identify as Black women, and they also happen to be Latina. And for many of us, we probably knew, many of these individuals were Latina, but I know for myself, like, I was surprised initially when I, let's say, found out Tessa Thompson was Latina, because just off of the sheer assumption that one would make just from her last name, right? And then you came to discover that I believe she's Panamanian. So these are just like the everyday assumptions that are going on, that, the associations that we make just from sort of either physical characteristics or labels that we've got on people without necessarily knowing these are all people who proudly identify as Black women and as Latin women. And what does that mean, right? Is there a conflict there? So we're going to take a second. We're going to watch a quick video that talks a little bit more in depth about what it means to be Black and Latino. No? You can't hear it? Oh, you can?
When he went closer.
Ah, okay. Got it.
Because of my skin color, because of my hair. I would just hear my family be like, oh, don't go with somebody that's dark skinned. Dark skin in the Latino community isn't considered beautiful. We've been colonized so poorly that we want to identify with being white so much, not all of us, but many of us, that we look down on dark skin.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause right here. Any initial reactions to that video? Anything that came up that resonated for you from that video?
Been able to hear it better.
It was really low?
Yeah, we could never get that sound right. So I'm glad that some of it was captioned.
Well, I'll share a little bit about what stood out to me. So obviously this is a diverse group of people who identify as Black, who are, identify as Latino. And one of the things that really stood out to me actually was towards the end, the older gentleman said, at the end of the day, it is on you, right? It's up to you to talk about difference, to share. It's almost like this hearkening to the collective responsibility that we all have in this process. When I'm talking to people about inclusion or about dismantling racism, or there tends to be a lot of conversation around like, well, they don't get it, or it's not my job to teach them, and all of those things are true, right? And also, in order to get to the place where we can all sit around the same table and have a real conversation and talk about why you don't get it and talk about what's different, right? A lot of the sessions that I host with clients, I mean, by the end, my job is to create safety in the conversation. And so by the end, you have, let's say, white people acknowledging and saying, yeah, I really don't get it. I don't relate. It doesn't resonate. I think it's wrong to, have these programs in place because X, Y, Z. But they feel the safety to say that in a, it's not from a place of malice. It's truly from their lived experience. And to hear other people, right? These are people who work together or who go to the same school or who are collaborating on things, and they have no idea what their stances are, what their differences are, where they disconnect, where they connect, where they align. And so that's really the point of this conversation today. And hopefully of the continued conversations you'll have in this space is, again, leaning into that discomfort, paying attention to what the difference is, asking questions, being curious, but also what is my responsibility, right? What is my responsibility in this process, in my community, right? So at your university, what is your responsibility? What role are you playing? Even if you're just a student, first year, minding your business, trying to figure out where that building is, well, pre-COVID, but if you're just trying to figure out the system, that's okay. We still all have some degree of responsibility to the community, all the communities that we're a part of, all of these identities that we associate with. We have a responsibility to bring awareness to, right? To dismantle some of those injustices, that marginalization, the misconceptions that exist around all of those things. Any other thoughts around the video? I'm sorry you guys couldn't hear it that well, but any other things that kind of stand out from that conversation or from the video itself before we move on?
Well, something from just touched on or, brought up by definitely one of the speakers was, she was talking about how she had been called names by her own community and that discrimination was coming from within her own community. And I think that's a really important conversation that we need to have, that a lot of times, sometimes this discrimination is coming even from within our own communities towards other members. And we overlook it because it's like, oh, well, we're marginalized in this other way, so we can't necessarily marginalize others when we definitely can. Absolutely.
Such a great point. I think one of the other ladies also spoke about like the self-hate, right? And it goes back to that programming, that societal cultural programming that we all, it's the autopilot that we run on. And so absolutely, yeah, there's people within our own groups, those subgroups that are having, again, a different intersectional experience that we are not privy to, blind to, ignorant about. So we are kind of, again, coming to a place in our age, and it's been happening for some time, but really sort of with a sense of urgency at this point around, okay, how do we create awareness, right? How do we not, you know, it's not so much about, it's really about paying attention to what our differences are, to caring about what people's differences are, and allowing that, right? One of the best bosses that I ever had was this 50-something-year-old white man who, on day 2 of being my boss, sitting in a meeting with me, we're sitting across from each other, and he says, you know what? I know you're a little crazy, and you're sitting here with your hands crossed, and I know that's not really you. I know that you're a little crazy. So what I want you to do is bring that crazy to work, because that's what's going to make you good at what you do. That's what's going to make you thrive. And in my mind, I'm coming into work because, you know, behaving a certain way, because in my mind, professionalism, the standard for professionalism is this and this and this, right? And so I need to fit myself into that box. But the reality is, who came up with those standards for professionalism? Who said we have to talk like that? Who said we have to dress like that? Who said I can't have a ring in my nose, right? That was something, he freed me, right? With that, with the knowing of what I actually am, all the difference that I bring is what actually makes me good at the work that I do, right? So let me go ahead and share my screen again so we can move through some more of this discussion. And if there are any other thoughts, please feel free to chime in. All right, so what we were just talking about, I mean, you pointed to it perfectly, Ana Sofia, is cultural racism, right? So we're talking about the conditioning, we're talking about the programming, we've talked about all these different categories that could be, you know, the identities of our place of origin, or our values, or our belief systems, and then the subcategories within that. What we know is that we operate within a system of cultural racism, right? It is when the dominant culture is founded upon norms, values, beliefs that validate and give advantages to white people while marginalizing and oppressing people of color. That is the system, the world that we live in, right? There's, regardless of how you feel about the issue, the data shows that the disparity exists when it comes to access, opportunity, and quality of life, when, as you compare people of color to their white counterparts, and specifically Black people. So why is that, right? So when we look at that, we understand, based on everything that we just shared, that racism exists, you know, it's institutional, right? It's systematic, it's not always present and conscious, but it's something that we participate in, all of us do, right? We all participate in it on some level when we aren't paying attention, or when we aren't using our skills to create awareness, or to be aware ourselves, right? Most of these diversity and inclusion conversations are really about self-awareness. It's not so much that, you know, I need to change everything, you know, my autopilot so much, but it really is, okay, these are the biases I have. Let me check myself. Let me make a different decision. You know, I grew up a certain way, so I'm going to interpret things a certain way, but I don't have to make choices based on that. I can create self-awareness around how I typically respond, right? Or what my default way of seeing things are. And that's really what the goal is creating that self-awareness, and through that self-awareness, making it actionable, where we're expanding that awareness to others within, you know, this framework of cultural racism that, again, is pervasive, it's everywhere, it's in all parts. So why does it exist? We can't talk about this without talking about slavery, right? So if this is big, it's huge, it's heavy, people, you know, don't like to talk about it, but the reality is this is where it, you know, this is where it begins, right? And the thing, so as we start to look at, again, this conversation of intersectionality between Latinos and the Black community, or now the opening up of this Afro-Latino identity, right? That people are acknowledging more and more. This is kind of where the story begins, right? And I think one of the important parts of this is that also, for many people, we don't necessarily know our history and the history of others. So we cannot really make, you know, we cannot really make informed decisions or judgments, because we don't know the whole story, right? We don't have the whole history. So when we think about slavery in this country, right, most people are raised to think that the slave experience is specific to, you know, Black people in this country, right? That the slaves in this country are the ancestors to the Black people in this country, right? So this is an instance of what is known as African American exceptionalism, meaning that if there is a Black experience in this country, it's that of Black or African Americans, right? But that's actually not true. We know that because we just saw there's so many other people having the Black experience, right? And so it actually is a lot, it spreads further than what we know. It expands further than what we know. And then there is a collective Black experience that includes all of those people as well. So when we look at the actual slave trade, and not to get too into the nitty gritty of it, but these are key things. The slave trade begins in the late 1400s, early 1500s. Christopher Columbus, we know, came to the Americas in 1492. Does anyone know where he landed? No clue. Nobody knows. So Christopher Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is present day Dominican Republic and Haiti. And he never, ever, ever set foot on the mainland of the United States. Most people honestly do not know that, right? They have no concept of that because the way that we celebrate Christopher Columbus in this country, the way that certain communities do, the significance, right? The New World, the establishing of the New World and all of those things that represents. But the reality is that Christopher Columbus actually never came to mainland North America, right? He came to the Americas, the Caribbean area, but never to the United States. So that is a misconception that a lot of people have when we talk about not just the discovering, right, of this land, but also slavery and the slave trade, how it originated anyway. So you have the arrival of Christopher Columbus. The 13 colonies don't get established until the late 1700s. And so what's happening between that time period, right? We know that slavery commenced in the Caribbean. And so there's 200 years or plus, right, that go by before we see any sort of mass introduction of slavery into the United States, right? Or at the time, the 13 colonies. The other statistic that I just want to point out real quick here is that, let's see here. You have 12.5 million Africans that were shipped to the New World through the Middle Passage, 10.7 million of which actually survived, that disembarked in the Caribbean and South America. But of those, right, so of those 10.7 million, only 388,000 were shipped directly to North America, okay? So what's the point of me saying all of this? The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because this is a quick map to show you that the slave trade begins in West Africa. It follows the Middle Passage. The majority of the Africans that travel to the New World go to Brazil, right? Over the course of all of these hundreds of years now, this is the whole gamut. And then you see the other vast majority go to the Caribbean. And from there, what you're actually seeing is that those that make it to the Caribbean primarily are the ones that end up being then shipped to the United States. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because as early as this time period, there is an intersectionality between the Black experience in the Caribbean and the Black experience in the United States. There was, I think they used to call them like seasoning camps in the Caribbean that they would hold slaves at before they would ship them off to the United, to North America, during this time period. So this is happening over the course of hundreds of years. We never hear that. We don't know that, right? These are specific aspects of the history that matter, because then it starts to tie together. Now you see that the Black experience in the United States cannot be separated from the Black experience in the Caribbean, even though they are in and of themselves completely different and unique and culturally, specific and nuanced. But then you see the Caribbean, also, South America, Central America, all of those areas begin to receive, that migration of slaves into those areas. And so this is where we start to see the Black experience, ingrain itself into each of these unique cultures, unique nations, unique ethnicities as well, right? There is an integration that happens on all those levels. So what we know, let's see, what we know is that based on everything we just shared, there is a primary, a dominant white supremacy culture that has produced these institutions in which these intersecting identities have difficulty not only creating solidarity, commonality, support for one another, just awareness, but also just being able to survive, expand, grow, develop, right, as their counterparts, because there is a whole system that has been put in place now, right? We see that it is correlated on all levels within all of the Americas, in which that white supremacy culture is, quite dominant, and it dictates all the ways that the systems work. And just like I mentioned, so who said what professionalism is, right? Who determined that I have to look X way in order to show up to work and be professional? When we talk about code switching, if you're familiar with code switching, and there's nothing wrong with code switching because it is definitely a tool, but when we think about, okay, well, who determined that in order for me to be viewed professional, I have to speak like this? How is that a reflection of the quality of my work ethic, of my ability to collaborate with others, that I speak a certain way, right? So that is similarly applicable to when we talk about just white supremacy culture in general. When we talk about how we're categorized, how we understand each other, what it means to be Black, what it means to be, a Black Latino or a white Latino, where do those definitions, terms, that conditioning, where does it come from, right? And so we have to begin questioning those things, because those are not things that we decided, right? When I think about what my identity is, I have people tell me all the time, as an ethnically ambiguous person, I have people tell me all the time. I have my dark Dominican cousins say, "Oh, girl, you white." I have, other Black women say, "Girl, you a sister, stop it." Everywhere I go, depending if I'm in Atlanta, if I'm in New York, if I'm in California, I am a different construct of race. And I'm all those things, right? And I fully embrace and accept that I'm all those things. And where I choose to, or how I choose to make those associations does depend on the context, right? And it does depend on the context of the conversation. In a certain moment, I may be choosing to be in solidarity with, a community, right? And in another context, I may choose to be in solidarity with another community, all while then also understanding my privileges, right? So I know I may I identify as Afro-Latina, but I also understand the privileges that come with looking how I look, right? Being fair-skinned, and all of the intersection of all of those different identities, right? As we go through that. So who am I, right? We were just talking about this earlier. When we're asked to choose, these are just like some quick examples of terrible, categorizations, right? So please indicate your ethnicity: American, Asian, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, white, 2 or more ethnicities. I mean, when we were defining ethnicities earlier, is Black and Latino, is being Black in ethnicity, is being Hispanic or Latino in ethnicity? These are questions that are not clear. And so in this lineup of questions, for some of us, we're looking at it like, the other one we have here is, what does it say here? Please select one. So for me, I can't be Latina and Black or white or biracial or multiracial. I have to pick just one, right? Based on whatever this is. And most of the time I end up putting other. And here I can't even say other because it says a race, ethnicity not listed here. So it's just a terrible capture, right? Now, there are some people who are, trying to develop awareness and consciousness. So here are some other examples of some, more informed demographic questions. So what nationality are you? This is now another use of a word, right? That they're all meant to capture the same thing. Caucasian and Hispanic. So it gives you the option to check all that apply. On the one to the right here, we have, are you Hispanic and Latino? So now they've made the separation because they know that Hispanic and Latino does not necessarily exclude or preclude any of the other categories that we have here. So I could be Hispanic and Latino and then identify as, and it says select one or more: Black, Native American, Asian, whatever the case may be. So we're making progress, right? You're seeing organizations that are developing that awareness, because the reality is that Latinos are not all one thing. And we've seen this evidence in probably nothing greater than these elections that have, transpired over the last, couple of months. Obviously the national election, but also me here being in Georgia, there's been a lot of, if you've been following, there's been a lot of just really pivotal political change that's been happening. And what you hear, if you're watching CNN, if you're watching Fox, whatever you're watching, there is a constant conversation about the Latino vote. And I can tell you right now, well, actually, let me throw it back to you. What is wrong with the term Latino vote? It's me and you, Ana Sofia, let's go.
Well, it seems like, there's so many different elements to our community. I mean, even looking at like even calling it like the Mexican vote versus like the Cuban vote or things like that, even that is a monolith, because there's so many different intersectionalities, as we've talked about. But I mean, Latin America is a whole continent, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't say everyone votes in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, when you look at so we saw how the histories sort of began, or not necessarily began, but how the intersection with the Black experience began in the Americas. And then we also know that for each unique nation and those individuals who migrated from those nations to the United States, those are very specific histories, right? Puerto Ricans have had a completely different engagement and interaction with the institutions in the United States than Dominicans, right? And they're right there, but these are two completely different different assimilations into, American culture, if you will. The same is true of, let's say, Cubans. Cubans have a very specific migration to this country that happened due to very specific overall, right? This is a generalization, very specific circumstances in their country. And so they have a completely different, again, engagement, affiliation, assimilation to the institutions in this country because of why and how they chose, or how they needed to arrive here. And so you see that all across the board, because of the unique histories that have taken place in those home countries and then the subsequent migrations here. People are having completely different experiences. Some of us came here, I'm privileged. My mother migrated to this country. And so while we had, I wasn't born here either, but while we had the immigrant experience, she came here on a student visa and, had the opportunity to get educated. And so my immigrant experience is completely different than, let's say, my partner, who's also Dominican. So these are just like the thing, the monolith of the Latino vote is just unfathomable, because Latinos in California are ethnically and historically, I mean, you name it, different than Latinos in New York, right? Or Latinos in Florida, whatever the case may be. And so this is something where we see, again, that programming, that conditioning, this conditioning. I mean, I myself, I was a political science major at Rutgers University, and I was using the term Latino vote until it dawned on me, this isn't real, right? There is no cohesive Latino, comprehensive Latino vote. There are unique groups and subgroups of individuals who care about different things, So the reasons why we end up kind of in this programming, again, going back to that white supremacy culture, all of these, I'm not going to go through every single one, but these are the key areas that have been identified. If you're familiar with Tima Okun's work, she is the person who has come up with a framework for white supremacy culture. And I can forward that information along after this. But essentially, these are the things that end up creating sort of that conflict or that marginalization of folks. So really quickly, perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality. I mean, you can literally see this in, like, let's say we're talking about, again, the Latino vote. There is a sense of urgency about campaigning. There is either or thinking, right? So either you're Black or you're Latino, right? Or you're part of the Latino vote or you're not, right? And so all of these different areas are how through the dominance of white supremacy culture, we don't take the time to pause and say, where are the intersections? Where are the intersections of identity where these things, these ways of being are creating, discriminatory lived experience for people, right? Or continue to create disadvantages and the marginalization of other people. So, we're looking at, let's see, this idea of individualism, which is a huge part of the capitalist mentality in this country. The fear of open conflict, we avoid that, right? Like, let's not say it, for generations at our workplaces, we are not supposed to talk about who we are. Personal stuff stays at home. I'm fortunate enough that I get to do this work with all types of different people. And sometimes when I'm talking to people who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s and are still in the workforce, they say to me, well, we grew up in a culture where we were told and programmed that to believe that we don't discuss personal at work. We leave that at home. And now we're in a society in which you can't come to work and thrive and be your best self without being yourself, right? That's the reality, right? That's what the new generations have called for. And in fact, what we're seeing just statistically is that the more diversity, the more we can bring ourselves to work and have that real inclusion, the better we work, the more productive we are. If I feel like I'm seen and people might not agree with me and they might think I'm crazy, but at least they know that I'm crazy, right? Or they know what I'm bringing to the table, what my strengths are, what they can call on me for, this is the reality that we live in. And so when we start talking about dismantling racism or standing in the face of white supremacy culture, these are some of the, values, if you will, that perpetuate that way of thinking. So as we move forward, we're starting to see that, more Latinas, more Latinos in general, not just to limit it to women, but are choosing to identify as Afro-Latina, right? For myself, that's very important. I want to let people know that I know what my history is, and where I stand in terms of solidarity for the different communities that I participate in. And so that is important for me. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said that, right? I would only identify as Latina, or because of my fair skin, I wouldn't necessarily identify as Latina. But then you look back at the history of how our nations were formed, and you know that if I looked like this, and I wasn't from the Dominican Republic, and my family was from the States, would I be Black? Would I, like, what would people call me, right? What category would I fall under, right? So these are the things that we want to think about. How we can disrupt the culture. So we're running, we've got about maybe less than 15 minutes left together. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your unique experience at Marymount. In what ways do these challenges show up on your campus, right? Or in your classroom, or within the university school system, with professors, with colleagues, with peers? How do the concepts that we've talked about today, how do they show up? Or if they don't, you can talk about that too. But does any of this resonate with how you are experiencing your day-to-day, or your overall collegiate experience?
Students.
We can let the clock run out. Or, okay, so maybe you don't have a specific example of how you see these things impacting your day-to-day. What if you could imagine for yourself and for others like you, or others with these sort of intersecting identities, where could some of these barriers show up? How could it impact the student experience, or a professor's experience, or an administrative experience? how can it show up? Maybe you haven't seen it, but what are potentially some barriers that could exist for individuals with these intersecting identities?
Well, I can talk a little bit about what I've seen before, maybe to kind of open the floor up and hopefully. I know that one of the things that I see as a challenge is that we don't necessarily have a lot of these conversations. I don't know, and students who are here, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But in conversations with some people, I've heard that we don't necessarily have these conversations in the classroom and the academic level. A lot of these conversations happen outside in multicultural spaces, between friends or between like trusted mentor mentee kind of relationships. But like in the classroom, we, I think, still have some work to do to be more representative of what histories we tell, what politics we focus on, what everything a little bit. There's a lot of voices missing in the classroom, I'd say, even just in the curriculum level.
And I'm just going to throw, since you're going, and this is for anyone, but so those challenges exist. What, if any, I mean, obviously you have Dean Barry, who is, part of a movement or a initiative to help address some of those things. What are some ways that exist, or that, going back to kind of that idea of collective responsibility, what are things that we can each do to participate in that necessary shift and that necessary dismantling? I know, deep questions, but it could be something simple, right? It could be.
Ashley, go ahead.
Okay. I was just not sure yet. Okay. So going on like what Anna Sophia was saying, it just brought back like some memories. I remember like my freshman year, like my English class, my professor had us like, it was doing like a personal essay. I honestly forgot what it was about, because specifically, like, I guess you can choose like any aspect of your life and just like, I guess, like write about it. And I'm DACA, so like I'm a dreamer, so I chose that and I tried to explain it. I remember like her reading it and she was like, "What's DACA?" Or and like she just didn't really know, and like she kind of put me like on the spot in front of everybody, but it was like things like that. I wasn't sure, like she just didn't know, but like I remember like I tried to explain it and I knew like some students didn't know. And I've actually like came to that even in my high school, like just like a lot of like teachers and like friends, they didn't know what it meant. And I forgot, I was gonna say something else. But yeah, I think that on what you were saying on like of like what we can do is, so actually this is something that we've like talked about in my club a lot, in the Dreamers Club, is of just like a lot of like trainings and discussions that we can have like with students and like staff about for example, like what we talked about today, and just like different definitions that we should all know, or how to be like more inclusive and how to be more educated with others.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think, I love always starting with that, with those first three, the question about identifying those things, because it just, again, it seems so straightforward. We use those words all the time, right? Nationality, ethnicity, race, blah, blah, blah. But like, what are we really talking about, right? And, for your professor or whoever, right, to not be in touch with things that have grave implications, right, at the end of the day to the student experience, it says something. It says something. If we can't even define nationality, ethnicity, and race in a way that is fair and cohesive, how do we even get to those things, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. I think it's the communication. It is the bringing light, bringing awareness to, creating our own self-awareness. But like you said, you know, being able to bring those continued conversations. And that's also why I always say, this is, you know, this is just today. We're having a conversation. Many of you who are in this room, it's probably because you already care about this stuff on some level, right? So how do we then take this conversation somewhere else, right? What is the thing that we want to walk away from this conversation saying, you know what, I'm going to, you know, my ripple effect is going to be, I'm going to host my own program, or I'm going to share this information that I got with you know, the student organization that I'm a part of. Whatever the case may be, it's really about identifying something actionable, right? It doesn't mean you necessarily have to go like, I know when the protests were happening this summer, I was like, I gotta go, right? This is history in the making and I gotta be there. And my partner, who happens to be a civil rights attorney, was like, that's good, you do that. I'm gonna go handle this legislation real quick, you know, because we're not all playing the same role, and we don't have to, right? But what is the thing? What is the thing that I am going to contribute to, or that I'm going to participate in, that's gonna make a difference, right? Even if it's, you know, even if it's something small. And so that's what I encourage you all to think about, you know, as we go forward, especially as it pertains to what are the things that are going on in your campus. I know that, you know, there's a lot of new initiatives, right? There's the 5-year strategic plan that has gone out. And to what extent does to what extent do those conversations involve diversity and inclusion, right? And I'll tell you what, it's up to the students and the faculty and staff, but it's up to you all to be that voice. Because, and I'll give you, you know, just another example for myself. I'm not saying do this, but when I was an undergrad, we armed a series of protests against, against the administration at Rutgers University, to the point where we even handcuffed ourselves. Don't do this, but, or do whatever you want, but don't do this. Handcuffed ourselves to, you know, the buildings, and we're you know, we had a list of demands. We organized ourselves to ask for things, you know, and this was actually specifically the Latino community at Rutgers University, you know, which is like 30,000 students large, right? So within that, the Latino community is pretty big, pretty substantial. And we're seeing all these other student organizations get resources, get new laptops, get programming space, get this. And then we have this rinky-dink little house that we're supposed to do programs at. And, you know, and these computers that must have belonged to Abraham Lincoln, I don't know. But the point being, at some point we had to acknowledge, like literally speak up and acknowledge the disparity and call it out and say, this is unacceptable, right? We're the ones having the student experience. We're not here for you, you're here for us. So what is going on? And we consistently made those demands. Now, I'm not saying go out there and, you know, take the institution down unless you want to, but the point being, the point being that, you know, we all have a role to play. And that's really what the conversation about today is, you know, checking your own awareness and saying, did I know all of this? Who do I need to share this with? Where am I seeing these things pop up in ways that not only affect me, but affect my peers, right? The people that I'm in the classroom with, the people that I'm collaborating with, the people that I am in student organizations with, the professors themselves, honestly, because they are, you know, the faculty and staff are not excluded from those same challenges. So I will leave you all with that. I appreciate so much you giving me your time and attention for the last hour and a half. I love these conversations. Thank you for your engagement. Ana Sofia, we're best friends now. And, you know, I'll turn it over to Dean Barry in case there's anything else you wanted to, you know, wrap up with the group. But again, thank you so much. And if there's anything that, you know, I'll actually pop my email into the chat in case for any reason anyone wants to reach out and connect or has any follow-up questions. But otherwise, thank you all for your time today. And thank you for participating. It really takes something to take your time out to be here. So I appreciate you.
Thank you.
I dropped an evaluation link in the chat. If you guys could you all could fill that information out. We want to continue to have conversations with Ella. So thank you all for
Yes.
coming. Does anyone else have anything to share or any comments to make?
Thank you so much for being here, Ela. We are so happy to have you here, and thank you for leading these discussions.
Hopefully it won't be the last. Hopefully we'll see each other again, but I appreciate it. This is what I love to do. So I'm thankful that we could get something out of it today. Hopefully you got some value. Oh, and I just popped I sent it as a direct message.